I stood there in the courtroom that day, a quiet woman facing my husband and his mistress, and even the judge seemed surprised by my determination. It all began on a rainy afternoon, back when I was just a little girl hiding in the warmest corner of our old house, wrapped in a blanket. That corner used to be my safe haven, where my mother would tell me stories. Those moments were pure happiness, filled with whispers and laughter. But now that corner had become nothing more than a lonely hiding place in an empty house. My mother was gone. In her place, a heavy silence hung over every wall and corner. It felt as if all my sadness had seeped into the very walls of the house. I heard my father Jerry's footsteps, echoing down the hallway. They were heavy and slow, each step carrying the coldness of unspoken hatred. He had changed since losing his wife. The once kind man was now cold and distant. Whenever he looked at me, there was a dark gleam in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at his daughter, he was seeing something else. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I knew there was something wrong about the hatred my father directed at me. But at 6 years old, I couldn't fully understand the meaning behind that coldness. He called out my name, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. I emerged from my hiding place, trembling as I approached him. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the floor, too afraid to meet his eyes. I couldn't bear to look into them because I knew I would find no love there. He demanded to know why I was hiding there, spitting out the words. I raised my eyes slightly and answered in a frightened voice that I just liked that spot. He stared at me with undisguised contempt. I could imagine the question repeating in his mind, why was it me who survived instead of her? Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. He left me there with a lump in my throat, standing alone. I wished with all my heart that my mother would appear and fill this emptiness. But I knew that was a wish that could never come true. At night, the silence grew even deeper, and when my father went to sleep, I closed my eyes. I remembered the stories my mother used to tell me. I could still hear her sweet voice in my memory saying that life always gives us reasons to be happy. In my dreams, I imagined a different life. I pictured a home filled with love, where a father would look at me with eyes full of kindness. Every night, I made a promise to myself, and it became my guiding light. I promised that someday I would have a family who truly loved me. Until that day came, I had to endure the coldness and loneliness. Years later, I was sitting on a bench at college when it happened. I was surprised when someone like him spoke to me, and not knowing how to respond, I just nodded slightly. He, William, told me he liked the idea of writing his own story, while looking intently into my eyes, as if searching for something. He said he wanted a story with more love and less loneliness. Those words resonated deeply within my heart. This stranger seemed to understand something about me that I had never shared with anyone. As time passed, William and I spent more time together. Our days were filled with conversations, walks around campus, and sharing secrets under the starlit sky. I found something in him that I had never known before. He was someone who listened without judgment, who saw the light hidden behind the shadows. After several months, William confessed his feelings to me. That night under a tree in the park, he looked at me with such intensity that I trembled. William took a deep breath and told me he didn't know how to express his feelings. He said he could see my hidden sadness and the strength I kept inside, and he wanted to stay by my side and heal my wounds. My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst from my chest. I couldn't remember the last time someone had shown such genuine interest in me. William's face was sincere and unafraid, and I knew then that he could be the partner I had always dreamed of. Without saying a word, I hugged him. In that moment, I felt something in my life change forever. William kept his promise. In him, I found my sanctuary. Every day, through small gestures, William showed me a kind of love I had never imagined could exist. Those were days of discovery, building dreams together and making shared plans for the future. Soon, the idea of family began to take shape. When William proposed, I felt like I was finally taking the step I had longed for all my life. Our wedding was simple, with few guests, an intimate ceremony. Yet for me, it was the most beautiful day of my life, the day my dreams came true. As time passed, we built a home filled with little details. The photographs on the walls and laughter filling every room were proof of our happiness. I felt this was exactly the life I had always wanted. At night, I would watch William and feel grateful for every moment we shared, every unspoken promise kept. But every story has its challenges. Unavoidable friction began to appear, and at first, I tried to ignore it. They were small disagreements about household expenses and the long hours William spent at work. I blamed everything on stress, believing love would solve all our problems. But a small fear began to grow in my heart. It was like a shadow reminding me of the wounds from my childhood. A whisper telling me nothing lasts forever made me wary. Still, each night I closed my eyes and clung to the love I had found in William and the family we had built, hoping the shadows would disappear. I repeated my mother's words in my heart about life always giving us reasons to be happy. Time moved forward, and my dreams seemed to be becoming more real. The birth of our first child brought joy that filled our home with new life. The nights grew shorter, passing in a blur of exhaustion and newborn smiles lighting up our home. William also showed his warmest side, and when holding the baby, his demeanor was filled with the gentle tenderness shared within a family. With the birth of our second child, it seemed as though happiness had once again returned to their home. But then he started avoiding conversations by looking away, as if something was irritating him. The arguments started as small sparks that we both tried to extinguish quickly. However, as time passed, our disagreements became more frequent and intense. William no longer tried to hide his irritation. One night, after a long day, William came home dragging his feet. I managed a tired smile, wanting to share the day's events with him. But he only nodded slightly and collapsed onto the sofa, rubbing his temples. I quietly asked if he was okay. William let out a heavy sigh that filled the room with tension. He told me he had reached his limit, his voice lacking its former warmth. He said everything was becoming more difficult day by day, the house, the children, work, everything. I stared at him, shocked by his cold words. Until then, we had shared common goals, believing our sacrifices were investments in our future. But I saw something different in William's eyes now. I could see a spark of resentment in his eyes that I couldn't understand. I tried to ease the tension, telling him we were getting through this together. I reminded him that he didn't have to carry everything alone. But William suddenly stood up and paced around the room, as if searching for an invisible exit. He stared at me and said I wouldn't understand, his voice chilling me to the bone. He insisted there were things I simply couldn't comprehend. From that moment, I felt a cold distance growing between us. Days passed in silence, with only essential conversations about housework and childcare. William started coming home late every night, and even when he was home, he was absorbed in his phone or lost in his thoughts. I couldn't reach him in that private world of his. I tried to convince myself this was just temporary, just a passing crisis. Then William's mother, Carolyn, offered to help with the children. I accepted, hoping this might be a chance to improve my relationship with my mother-in-law. But I quickly realized Carolyn had no such intentions. She was cold, distant, and observed everything with a critical eye. She asked me in a falsely neutral tone if I really knew what I was doing, her voice full of disapproval. I took a deep breath and swallowed my words. I didn't want to make things worse, I just wanted to keep the peace. But Carolyn's constant negative attitude gradually wore down my spirit. My relationship with William became increasingly tense, and the loneliness I felt in my own home became unbearable. One night, I gathered my courage and decided to try approaching William one more time. I found him in his study, frowning over some papers. I spoke in a steady voice, letting the pain I had accumulated in silence show through. William didn't look up from his papers, but I could see his jaw tense. He told me coldly that he didn't have time for drama. I stepped forward and told him, this wasn't about drama. This was about our family, about what was happening between us, and why he was becoming so distant. When William finally looked at me, his eyes held a coldness I had never known. He told me that some things just had to be accepted as they were. He said I couldn't control everything. Those words devastated me. I felt an invisible wall standing between us. This was more than just a normal marital conflict, it was an unbridgeable distance. In that moment, I understood that William had something he didn't want to share with me. It was either a secret or frustration, something he had no intention of revealing. A few days later, when Carolyn came to help, I tried to hide my tears, but she noticed the sadness on my face. Instead of offering words of comfort, Carolyn looked at me with accusing eyes. She told me I couldn't afford to be distracted. From her words, I understood that to Carolyn, I was nothing but a nuisance. I was far from being the person she had wanted for her son. That night, in the silence of my room, I realized that the home I had dreamed of was beginning to crumble. The security I thought I had found in William now felt like a distant memory. One early morning, unable to sleep, I quietly got up and walked through the dark hallway to the living room. The house was wrapped in heavy silence, broken only by the sound of a message arriving on William's forgotten phone. My inner voice warned me not to look, to respect his privacy. But driven by weeks of doubt and pain, I picked up the phone. The screen lit up, displaying a message asking when he could sneak away again. The name shown in the notification was unfamiliar to me, Elizabeth. A sensation like a knife through my heart overwhelmed me. Holding the phone with trembling hands, I didn't know how to react. Feeling like the ground was crumbling beneath me, I put the phone back in shock and returned to bed. But that night, I couldn't close my eyes. The next day, I made up my mind to confront William. I moved forward, determined to know the truth and get answers. That night, when William came home, I sat at the edge of the sofa, waiting for him with my heart pounding. I started speaking, my voice trembling, not as strong as I wanted it to be. He stared at me, with a mixture of irritation and contempt in his eyes, as if my very existence was an annoyance. He asked what I wanted, not even trying to hide his coldness. I swallowed hard and gathered my courage to continue, knowing there was no turning back. I told him I had found messages from someone named Elizabeth. William said nothing, didn't even try to deny it. His expression was bored, as if he had been expecting this moment for a long time. When William shrugged and confirmed my fears about Elizabeth, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. His cold voice saying they would be together for a long time still echoes in my ears. Each and every one of his words pierced through my heart, each bringing deeper pain. He stood there, staring at me with such coldness, without a trace of regret, as if admitting his affair was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. My voice barely a whisper, I asked him why he would do this to us. William sighed and looked away, telling me that things hadn't been working for a long time. He said Elizabeth supported him and understood what he wanted in a way I never could. The cruelty in his voice grew as he continued, saying she had everything I lacked. His words echoed in my mind over and over, bringing waves of disbelief and unbearable pain. I fought back tears as my voice trembled, asking about all our years together. I couldn't understand how this man, who had once been my safe harbor, could speak to me with such coldness. William looked at me with a contemptuous smile, as if my question wasn't even worth answering. His final words came with almost complete disdain, saying I had never understood what he truly wanted. He suggested that perhaps marrying me had been a mistake all along. I stood there speechless, searching his eyes for any sign of regret but finding none. The stranger standing before me bore no resemblance to the man I had married. I wondered how I had missed such cruelty and indifference all this time. William stood up, gathered his belongings, and walked out of the room without looking back. I was left alone, feeling my world crumbling around me. In the silence, the tears finally came. I tried to understand how we had ended up here, but no answers came. We had built a life together over years, yet all our promises and words now rang hollow. As nights passed, William came home later and later, offering no explanations and barely acknowledging my existence. Every evening, I sat alone, feeling the emptiness grow larger with each passing hour. In my desperation, I went to Carolyn's house. Though she greeted me with her usual cold demeanor, I was determined to seek help. I hoped that as William's mother, she might offer some support. When I said I needed to ask her something, Carolyn raised her eyebrows and asked what I wanted now, not even trying to hide her irritation. I told her about William's affair and how he was trying to take everything from me. I begged her to stop him, to talk to him. Carolyn fell silent for a moment, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of understanding in her expression. But her face quickly returned to its usual cold indifference. With cruel words, Carolyn told me that men sometimes need change. I trembled at the coldness in her voice. She suggested that perhaps William had found something in Elizabeth that I could never give him. The coldness of those words was the final blow that broke me. In that moment, I understood I was completely alone. Neither my husband nor my mother-in-law saw me as someone with value or dignity. I was just a disposable part of their lives, an inconvenience they wanted to remove. But that night, through my tears and pain, I discovered something unexpected within myself. A flame of determination began burning in my heart. Though I was alone, I would not let them destroy me. For my children and for myself, I decided to fight. I vowed to find a way to stand up to those who tried to crush me. I spent the next few weeks in a storm of emotions and thoughts. Every morning I got up and smiled at my children, trying desperately to keep that smile from crumbling. I didn't want them to feel my sadness. But the wound from William's betrayal kept growing in my heart, bringing deeper pain. Sometimes the pain felt like it would crush me. Yet in that despair, something inside me began to grow stronger. The suffering reminded me why I had to endure. I had a responsibility to protect my children. One night after putting the children to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, lost in thought. William had come home late again, not even trying to hide that I was nothing but an obstacle to him now. I remembered when I once believed he was my safe harbor, and that memory mixed pain with anger. How could he dismiss me so easily? How could he show such contempt for me? As I watched the dim kitchen light reflect off the cold marble countertop, I made a decision. I would not let William take everything from me. I would not let him destroy the life I had worked so hard to build for our children. I had to fight. Whatever it meant, whoever I had to face, I needed to break through my wall of fear. The next day, with renewed determination, I took my first step into battle. Without telling anyone, I visited a lawyer and explained my situation. I told them about my marriage, William's betrayal, and how he was trying to take everything from me. As I spoke the words aloud, I realized my pain was beginning to transform into courage. The lawyer listened with a serious expression and gave me one piece of advice that rang like a revelation in my mind. The lawyer spoke firmly, telling me I had rights and did not deserve to be trampled on. He assured me that while William might have power, the law was on my side. Those words lit a spark of hope within me. For the first time in weeks, I finally felt supported, no longer completely alone. On my way home, I noticed a change in my demeanor. The sadness in my eyes had transformed into unwavering determination. That evening, when Carolyn came to help with the children, I decided to speak with her again. I looked straight into her eyes and told her firmly that we needed to talk. I said I believed she understood this situation better than anyone. I asked if she truly understood how serious this situation was. Carolyn looked at me with doubt in her eyes, but something in my determined expression made her listen. Though she maintained her usual hardness, she asked what I wanted to discuss in her characteristically cold tone. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, barely blinking. I told her this was about her grandchildren. I explained that William was trying to abandon us with nothing, without any thought for the children's happiness. I said I only wanted to protect their right to a proper life and secure future, and that deep down, I believed she wanted the same thing. At the mention of the children, I saw Carolyn's expression soften slightly. A flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. Despite her cold nature, she felt she didn't want to involve her innocent grandchildren in their father's decision. Carolyn remained silent for a while, and I could feel my words reaching her. She murmured that William would always be her son, speaking as if to herself. But then she admitted there were things even a mother couldn't justify. In that moment, I felt something shift between us. Though she maintained her coldness, I could tell Carolyn was beginning to question her previous support of William. I realized I had planted a small seed in her heart. I felt that seed might grow and turn things in my favor. In the days that followed, the tension in the house grew even more intense. William sensed something had changed and became increasingly irritable, no longer hiding his contempt. His disdain was obvious, but I refused to back down. I continued my visits to the lawyer and began documenting all of William's suspicious behavior and unexplained withdrawals. I felt each action strengthening my resolve, giving me confidence to face whatever came next. Finally, the day came when Carolyn made her decision. She called me one afternoon, asking to meet at a nearby park. When I arrived, unsure of what awaited me, Carolyn's serious expression told me this was no ordinary meeting. Carolyn told me directly that she had consulted a lawyer and would help me. I stared at her, with a mixture of surprise and gratitude on my face. Though I said nothing, I understood how much internal conflict this decision must have caused her. She was risking a lot by choosing to support me, her daughter-in-law, over her own son. Yet she could not ignore the pain and suffering William had brought to our family. In that moment, I realized that despite all the wounds, there was still humanity in this family. After a moment of silence to collect my emotions, I extended my hand to Carolyn in gratitude. The gesture conveyed thanks beyond what words could express. Having gained this unexpected ally, I finally felt I wasn't completely alone and prepared for the next step. That next step would be a courtroom confrontation, where William believed he held all the advantages. But I was no longer willing to back down. The day of the trial arrived. I stood in the courtroom, looking straight ahead, my mind filled with memories of the past. Next to me stood Gabriel, who was 8, and Samantha, who was 5. They watched me with a mixture of innocent curiosity and tension in their eyes. While they didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, they could sense the tension in the air. I held their small hands and tried to convey strength through my gentle smile. I whispered that everything would be all right, even as I felt a storm raging inside me. William entered the courtroom with his lawyer. Elizabeth sat beside him, wearing an arrogant and indifferent expression. She took her seat in the front row of the gallery, treating the trial as if it were mere entertainment. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach when I saw her. But I closed my eyes for a moment, to steady myself. Carolyn stood beside me, supporting me in this crucial moment. She gave me a small nod of encouragement, as if to show that justice still existed in this world. As the trial began, the judge asked me to take the witness stand. I walked toward it, taking deep breaths. I could feel William's gaze piercing me, but it now felt like the stare of a complete stranger. Taking another deep breath, I sat down and faced the jury with more determination than I had ever felt before. I was no longer the frightened woman who had silently endured her husband's contempt. Today I stood here to protect not just my rights, but Gabriel and Samantha's future. When the judge prompted me to tell my story, I felt as if time had stopped. I began speaking about my life, about meeting William in college, our shared dreams, and the family we had built together. My voice caught as I recalled how William had stopped looking at me, treating me as if I didn't exist. I told the court about his affair with Elizabeth, how he showed no remorse, and how he was trying to take everything from me. My voice carried pain but remained strong as I explained that William had not only betrayed me. He was trying to steal the future from our children, Gabriel and Samantha. The jury listened quietly, some showing sympathy, others directing angry glances at William. Their silent understanding gave me strength to continue. I described how I had endured weeks of humiliation, the pain of being abandoned by the husband I loved. When I finished my testimony, I looked directly at my husband. My gaze held not hatred, but the firm resolve of someone who had overcome suffering and found themselves again. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt as if I was finally releasing a burden I had carried for so long. Then Carolyn took the stand. She faced the judge with a serious expression, her demeanor showing an unexpected vulnerability. When she began speaking, she particularly surprised William. She admitted that she had initially supported her son's plans, thinking he was acting in his own best interest. But she confessed that seeing the suffering of me and her grandchildren had made her realize her mistake. Her voice trembled but remained firm as she acknowledged her responsibility. She declared she could no longer participate in such injustice, reminding everyone that I was the mother of her grandchildren, Gabriel and Samantha, who needed a safe future and peaceful home. William showed uncontrollable anger for the first time as his mother publicly condemned him. Elizabeth glanced at him sideways, seeming to realize this situation was far different from what she had imagined. The courtroom fell silent as the jurors nodded to each other, clearly moved by Carolyn's words. My lawyer presented evidence of how William had moved assets, trying to leave me penniless. The documents and financial records showed how he had transferred assets to Carolyn and Elizabeth's names. All the evidence pieced together to prove William's manipulation and betrayal. The evidence was clear, and the judge quickly saw through William's true intentions and plans. During closing arguments, William's lawyer tried to claim his actions were just misunderstandings, merely attempts to reorganize family assets. But these claims were weak and unconvincing. I watched him quietly, feeling sadness and anger at how cold and insensitive he had become. Finally, the judge turned to the jury and the verdict was delivered. I was awarded most of the assets, ensuring a stable life for Gabriel and Samantha. Meanwhile, William lost control of the assets he had tried to steal. Understanding the situation, Elizabeth stood up and left the courtroom without looking back. I looked at William, who once held power and believed Elizabeth would stay by his side, but now stood alone. He looked back at me, his eyes mixing anger with defeat. In that moment, I realized I had regained, not just property, but my dignity, and freedom as well. I held Gabriel and Samantha's hands tightly as we walked toward the exit, wrapped in the strength that true love gives. It was the kind of love I had always dreamed of giving to my family. As we crossed the threshold, I felt myself leaving behind the pain and shadows of my past. Those things no longer defined who I was. With the echo of the verdict still ringing in William's ears, I took my first step into a new life. William left the courthouse with heavy steps, as if dragging a burden with each move. His own decisions weighed heavily in his walk. I watched him from a distance, drawing Gabriel and Samantha closer to me. Just their presence gave me the feeling I could provide them with the security I had longed for. For the first time in a long while, I felt a peace I hadn't known before. It was a quiet tranquility born from facing pain without surrendering to it. Meanwhile, William sank into a sea of loneliness. Elizabeth, who until recently had been his accomplice and confidant, abandoned him after seeing the trial's outcome. In her final words to him, she made it clear she had no intention of sharing a future with a man who had lost both power and control. The bitterness of defeat and the weight of loneliness hit him even harder. A few days later, William made one desperate attempt as his last resort. He waited for me outside Gabriel and Samantha's school, knowing I came to pick them up every day. He thought he could appeal to me through memories of our shared life. When I saw him approaching with a calm expression, I felt my throat tighten. William called out to me to wait, approaching with a pretense of regret, saying we needed to talk. I looked at him, with a mixture of doubt and caution in my eyes. This wasn't the first time. He had tried to manipulate me with sweet words many times before. But I wasn't the same person anymore. Gabriel frowned at the sound of William's voice and clung to my legs, whispering, "Dad." Meanwhile, Samantha stared at her father with large eyes, as if questioning why their world had suddenly changed. I told William calmly that I had nothing to discuss with him. William took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He stepped closer, his voice trembling, suggesting we fix things and try again for the children's sake. I looked at him, my eyes mixing sadness with determination. There had been days when I longed to hear even a hint of regret in his voice. I had hoped for something that would make me believe he was still the man I had loved, but now his words rang hollow. I asked him softly but with newfound strength if he really thought this was for the children's sake. I told him it was because he couldn't stand being alone, but I wasn't a woman he could manipulate anymore. William tried to argue, but the words caught in his throat. I stepped back, positioning myself protectively, in front of Gabriel and Samantha, and spoke the words I had kept in my heart for so long. I assured him the children would be fine because they had me, and we had learned how to overcome difficulties and move forward together. I told him quietly but firmly that he needed to face the consequences of his actions. My voice was soft, but each word carried weight in the wind, holding not hatred but a heavy truth. I turned my back on William, who seemed to realize he had nothing left to say, and took my children's hands as we walked away. Gabriel looked at his father with serious eyes that seemed to understand far more than his young age would suggest. Samantha, though not fully comprehending the situation, simply held tightly to my hand and followed. William stood frozen, watching us leave, and I knew this image would be eternally etched in his memory. There was no going back now. The emptiness in his heart had become his new reality. He realized he had lost not just a wife, but the chance to see Gabriel and Samantha grow up, and the right to share in their laughter and sorrows. That night, William returned to the only house he had left. He sat on the sofa where conversations and laughter once filled the air, now surrounded by an insurmountable silence. He sent Elizabeth a message, but there was no response. He tried to call Carolyn, but she too had cut ties with him after the trial, making it clear she couldn't accept her son's actions. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of my words about facing the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, I returned home with Gabriel and Samantha. As I closed the door, I felt the dark and painful chapter of my life finally ending. I hugged my children tightly, silently promising them a life filled with love and hope. The shadow of the woman who had been insulted and betrayed by her husband was gone from my eyes. I had been reborn from my pain, stronger and wiser, ready to begin a new life. The scars remained, but they were part of the story that had led me to who I am now. The soft morning light streamed through the windows of our new house, filling every corner of the room. Though the house wasn't large or luxurious, it had what mattered most to me. It was family. These past months had been a storm of changes and difficult decisions, but in this warm, modest space, I felt the beginning of a new life. I was ready to leave the betrayal and shadows in the past and move forward on a new path filled with hope. In the next room, Gabriel and Samantha slept peacefully. They showed an amazing ability to adapt to their new life, which touched my heart deeply. There were difficult times when I wasn't sure how to answer their questions, but both children seemed to sense in their pure hearts that something good was happening. Sometimes Samantha would whisper to me, as if sharing a secret, that she loved this house because there was peace here. Every time I heard those words, I hugged her with gratitude, feeling that all our sacrifices had been worthwhile. After the trial, my life changed in many ways. I received support to build a stable life and started a small business from home. As time passed, I turned my hobby of sewing into a source of income. In those quiet hours, I put my heart into making clothes, and with each order, I took another step toward independence. It became a symbol of building my new life. One morning, while organizing fabric in my small workshop, Gabriel approached me with a curious expression. There was a mature wisdom in his eyes that made me both proud and a little sad. He sat beside me and after a few seconds of silence, asked in a small voice why his father didn't live with us anymore. I looked at him and gently took his hand, determined to answer honestly but carefully. I told him that sometimes people choose different paths, choosing my words carefully. I explained that what mattered was that we were together, and there would always be love here. Gabriel nodded as if he understood my words, and that answer seemed to be enough for him. Samantha, who had been quietly listening at the door, ran over and jumped into my lap, hugging me tightly. I kissed both their cheeks while quietly crying. In that moment, I felt the true bonds of family for the first time. The laughter and conversations I shared with my children taught me that life still offered joy and connection. It showed me I had the strength to face others without fear. One afternoon, as I watched Gabriel and Samantha playing with other children in the yard through the window, I remembered the promise I had made to myself, to create a home filled with love and peace. I could feel that dream becoming reality. That evening, as I was organizing my work tools, I had an unexpected visitor. Carolyn stood at the door with a bouquet in her hands, her expression mixing sadness and gratitude. I was too surprised to speak. The once cold and distant Carolyn now looked at me with the most sincere expression I had ever seen from her. With slightly trembling hands, Carolyn held out the bouquet and told me she wanted to express her gratitude. She admitted she hadn't treated me properly before and that she had been wrong. I received the bouquet as she explained she had come to apologize, and various emotions welled up in my chest. For a long time, I had hoped to hear such words from her, but now that I heard them, I understood that true forgiveness didn't depend on Carolyn's words but on my ability to let go of resentment. After a moment's pause, I smiled gently and beckoned her to come inside. That afternoon, we talked for a long time, like old friends who had finally reached a mutual understanding after years apart. Carolyn confessed that she had recognized her mistakes after witnessing my strength during the trial and how her grandchildren had opened her eyes. She had come to understand that true wealth lay not in power or money, but in love and bonds. From then on, Carolyn became an essential part of Gabriel and Samantha's lives. She visited every week, filling our home with stories and laughter, trying to make amends through small acts of love. Though the children were wary at first, they gradually began to accept her presence naturally. They found joy in having a grandmother who loved them and wanted to be part of their world. After several months, I felt my life had gained a stability I had never imagined possible. The nights were no longer filled with worry and sadness, but with peace and gratitude. Every corner of our new home reflected the life I had built with effort, love, and determination. One night, while Gabriel and Samantha slept, I sat by the window and looked up at the stars. I closed my eyes and remembered my mother, who had influenced me so much in my early years. In my heart, I heard her whisper that life always gives us reasons to be happy. That night, I realized I had found that reason. I had kept my promise, and finally, the peace and love I had been searching for were mine.